Welcome to today's review from the Organisational Change Review Desk. I'm looking forward to sharing with you a book, one of the oldest books in my collection of books. It goes way back to 1958. We're going to be having a look at this book today, The Dynamics of Planned Change. A classic in many ways by Lippitt, Watson and Westley. As I say, way back in 1958 we didn't really have the theories and practices we do today of organisational change, and this was one of the earliest books in understanding organisational change. Why is it important to theory and practice? I think many of the debates that have gone on in later decades, it's always good to go back to the source of the debate. A lot of things get lost in translation, and by going back to key early texts, I find it much easier then to see how the story's been told or misrepresented, and so much of the work in the middle of the last century has been misunderstood and misrepresented. So I'm going to give you a short overview of this book today. You can pick it up. I'm so chuffed to have this original copy, but in all honesty it wasn't that expensive. A few pound on a website that we often use to buy used products. Alternatively, if you're working or studying in a university, there is journal access to it. So International Journal of Social Psychiatry have loaded up a copy, but you do need to have the full access to get to that journal. So worth a look. I'm going to give you a flavour of it today. I won't be to do it justice, but just a few minutes. I'll be dipping into the book. In other reviews, the books are often in a digital format, but this really is an old book. I don't know if you can see that there. So I don't have it in a digital format, but I do have a copy. So I'm going to give you a few pointers from it. The reason I used to love using it in workshops was, for me, it's the first reference to change agents and change agency. So a lot of the leader debates, manager debates that ripple through organisations and business schools and other schools are all about who makes change happen. And you probably guessed at the moment that the fashionable view is that it's leaders. I disagree with that, but that's for another day. But who makes change happen is an interesting question. So we've got managers, leaders, or is it consultants, organisational consultants? Or is it the people who make up the organisation, the likes of you and I? We'll see. But this book has the first reference for me to change agency. So in my sad little world, that was a bit of a eureka moment, and I'm just finding the phrase. We call this outside agent a change agent. They say on page 10. We call this outside agent a change agent. So they're unfamiliar with the term and they're using it quite tentatively. There's then a little footnote by it, and if I give you the fuller discussion. The term was adopted by the National Training Laboratory staff in 1947 to facilitate discussions among heterogeneous groups of professional helpers. It is a term which has since proved very useful. They like this term, and for me this is one of the earliest origins. For clarification, National Training Laboratories, end of the Second World War, they were very much psychology driven, and they were tasked with improving productivity. They did have a very radical agenda challenging racism and discrimination, which is often lost. It's quite fashionable these days to critique their work, but they did some pioneering work back in the day, and we need to acknowledge that. A notion comes through in this passage in the book and throughout the book about helping people change. So again, this was very different to the change today, which I fear sometimes in it organisations can feel like, just do it, and this wasn't how change agency was envisaged at the beginning of this journey, this story. So it's worth keeping that in mind when somebody puts their finger in your chest. tells you just do it. I don't want to debate about it. Fair enough. I guess not. Major section of the chapter on problems of external relationships headed up some generalizations. What a lovely loose term. So much more humility back in the 50s. I couldn't see academics writing in those terms today. Anyway, there's a little passage here which is very, very clever. Because in the first place the diagnostic orientation of the change agent is in many ways a self-fulfilling prediction, if he looks, and it was he back in their day, if he looks for difficulties in communication, for instance, he will find them. And if his help is directed towards improving communication patterns, success will demonstrate to the client system that a solution of communication problems necessarily results in a more satisfactory state of affairs. It might sound obvious, but we don't talk enough about this idea of the self-fulfilling prediction. So what they're saying is the diagnosis, if you see it as a communication problem, it will become a communication problem. If you see it as a structural problem, it will become a structural problem. And you think, fair enough, I get that. But then equally, if you task somebody with solving it, so what we need is leaders to lead change. The solution will come out of that predilection, and they were sort of hinting at this in not a mischievous way. I'd go much more mischievous and say we construct the problems and then we construct the solutions, which is fine. It's your prerogative to construct what the heck you like, but just be mindful it's your construction. It isn't actually reality. So, might have to edit that bit out because it spoils it, doesn't it? But that's the way the world is. Getting to the core of this book, they have 7 phases, which is slightly simplistic, but what they're trying to do is map out a way through a process of change, so all credit to them. They've got these 7 phases, and a lot of the book takes you through the phases. So, client system discovers the need for help, sometimes with stimulation by the change agent. That's their phase 1, very much like that today. Second one, the helping relationship is established and defined. What a lovely phrase, the helping relationship. So this is about working together, it's about collaboration, it's about cooperation. Remember, this was post-war, they'd had dramatic conflicts, and there does, from what I can make out from this literature, seem to be an era of working collaboratively together. In a lot of organisations that would be heresy now. The idea of helping people through processes of change is not always the case. Third phase, the change problem is identified and clarified. Always good to understand your problem. Lovely Charles Handy saying the prerequisite of action is analysis. I've corrupted that a bit, but analysis then action, whereas we live in a world where do this, do that. So that's a good point. Fourth phase, alternative possibilities for change are examined. Change goals or intentions are established. That fourth one's clever. Alternative possibilities for change. There's no one best way to manage change, there's no one best way to understand change, there's just a set of alternatives, and the more we can work across those alternatives in theory and practice, the better. The fifth one, and this was another remarks, Eureka's. Change efforts in the reality situation are attempted. They've got the word reality situation in quotation marks. So let's just read it for you again. Phase 5, change efforts in the reality situation are attempted. Reality situation in quotation marks. Postmodernism and some very clever later academic work has brought us to understand, thinking of social construction of reality, the 1960s, Berger and Luckman, that all reality is constructed. And these authors seem to be acknowledging that to some extent. The reality situation, quotation marks, it might not be reality, they're warning us. Phase 6, change is generalised and stabilised. Again, you see later change models doing that. And then the 7th one, the helping relationship ends, or a different type of continuing relationship is defined. these authors wanted to get us away from notions of dependency, a bit like drug addicts and drug dealers, and there is a concern with a powerful consultancy that there might become too dependent a relationship. If you want to read more about that, there's a lovely textbook by James McCullman and co-authors where they look at the objective outsider and do a whole chapter on why that's important. It's a really nice chapter, that one. Perhaps for another review another day, Mark. Yes, perhaps. Moving forward, just one last quotation. Towards the end, there's 2 chapters and they're really looking at the ways forward, and it's quite tentative but quite exciting in a way. They are very much pioneers and they see a responsibility that goes with that. And they put out this warning that I'm really pleased to share with anyone watching this video. All of these questions and many others involves moral choice. Consequently, it is important that training for all change agents should include a general study of social values, as well as a specific study of professional ethics and an analysis of personal motivations. So remember, this is the book where I found the earliest reference to change agency. These were the authors who took on the responsibility of trying to say how change agency might happen, and what they're encouraging at day 0 is the idea of studying social values. So there was a preoccupation with working with the wider society. Obviously sociology and studies do that. I don't always know if business organisations do, but there are signs that that's beginning to happen again. There needs to be professional ethics. Again, there's an argument for anyone who calls himself a change manager, a change leader. She or he should have a set of ethics which govern how they make change happen. There's some work being done to that, but there's a lot more needs to be done. And an analysis of personal motivation, that's another clever one. Why are you making change happen? Well, if you're in a work organisation, it's probably part of what you're paid to do. But you need to think about your own personal motivation beyond that instrumental need, because to some extent it can have huge impacts on people's lives. And we've seen over the last decade, think to the global financial recession, a lot of that was about some really bad leading of change and transformation in the finance sector, and the austerity that poured upon societies across the world was horrendous. So we do need to think about our personal motivations if we're going to make change happen. The reason they're saying that is it brings you back to the moral choices and working with within some sort of ethical framework. So, beginning to sound like a lecture now, and it's very easy to tell you to do it, but you could point back at me and say, Mark, you need to do it, and that's a fair comment. But anyway, I've shared some of my thoughts and feelings on an ancient book. My future posts will be much more up to date.